Moon Jae-in, the former president of South Korea, has been noted for having transformed parts of the country's economy, at least according to some observers, within the relatively short amount of time he served in office from 2017 to 2022. Some people believe that he has contributed to the overall well-being and economic growth of South Korea, citing his expansion of social programs and attempts to manage external economic challenges. Others, however, argue that his policies have been controversial, raising questions about unintended economic consequences, slower growth, and difficulties in fulfilling certain promises. But just how did South Korea truly perform under Moon Jae-in? Did he really push South Korea to become better? To better understand this, let's explore the country's economic performance under his administration, as well as the main policies he implemented. Let's start with economic performance. To evaluate a president's economic performance, economists often look at key indicators like GDP growth, unemployment rates, income distribution, trade performance, and inflation. These are basically measurements that tell us how well an economy is doing. To keep things simple, we'll focus first on GDP growth, which is one of the most common indicators. GDP growth, in simple terms, shows how much a country's total economic output grows or shrinks each year. It's basically a big number that sums up all the goods and services produced in the economy. When GDP grows, it generally means the economy is getting bigger. When it shrinks, it means it's getting smaller. According to data from the World Bank, South Korea's GDP has grown steadily from 2000 to 2023, but the growth rate has slowed down in the years after 2010. This slowdown in growth is not just a South Korean phenomenon. Many advanced economies, after their periods of rapid industrial growth, have seen slower growth rates as they mature. If we specifically look at Moon Jae-in's term, which ran from 2017 to 2022, the data suggests that the average GDP growth during his administration was about 2.42%. If we compare this to previous presidents, Park Geun-hye from 2013 to 2017 saw an average GDP growth rate of around 3.06%, and Lee Myung-bak from 2008 to 2013 witnessed an average of about 3.31%. Although these differences aren't huge, it is quite visible that the growth rate under Moon Jae-in was somewhat slower. Now, we must ask, does a slower growth rate mean his economic policies were wrong? It's complicated. Each administration faces different global and domestic conditions that affect how well the economy does. Moon Jae-in faced major external challenges, notably the COVID-19 pandemic, which hit the global economy hard. South Korea's GDP, just like many other countries, contracted during the pandemic. This was the first time South Korea's GDP contracted significantly since the 1997 Asian financial crisis. Also, before the pandemic, Moon's administration had to deal with growing global uncertainties like the US-China trade war initiated under President Donald Trump. Such global tensions reduced trade flows and investments worldwide, impacting export-heavy countries like South Korea. Moreover, countries that are reliant on exports, such as South Korea, were particularly vulnerable to these trade tensions, and this makes it difficult to directly blame domestic policies alone for slower growth. Another way to understand how well South Korea performed is to compare it not just with its own past, but also with countries at a similar level of income. According to the World Bank's classification, South Korea is considered a high-income economy. High-income economies include countries like the United States, Germany, Japan, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. By comparing South Korea's growth under Moon Jae-in to the average growth rates of other high-income countries, we see that South Korea still managed to grow at a rate that often exceeded or at least matched these peers, especially during 2017 to 2020, where South Korea's economy performed much better, and even during the COVID-19 pandemic, where high-income economies contracted massively. Yet South Korea outperformed. Beyond GDP, Moon Jae-in's administration placed significant emphasis on public social spending. Public social spending includes government spending on things like healthcare, education, pensions, unemployment benefits, and housing support. For a long time, South Korea was known for its relatively low level of social spending compared to other developed countries. Historically, South Korea's development strategy focused heavily on rapid industrialization and export-driven growth, leaving less room for a broad, welfare state. As a result, South Korea lagged behind major advanced economies in terms of social safety nets. When Moon Jae-in took office, he introduced various public welfare programs, including baby bonuses and increases in basic pensions, as well as moves to raise the legal minimum wage. While critics, including the conservative Liberty Korea Party, claimed that such measures were too generous and would hurt the economy in the long run, supporters felt these policies were necessary to address South Korea's aging population, income inequality, and the need for stronger welfare institutions. Data from Our World in Data and OECD databases show that while South Korea's public social spending as a share of GDP was still relatively low compared to places like Germany, Japan, and the United States, the growth in social spending accelerated under Moon Jae-in's tenure. Between 2000 and 2016, social spending grew slowly, but from 2017 to 2022, it picked up more sharply. Although the difference, from about a 7.81% annual growth rate to about 9.31% annually in social spending, might seem small, it is important to know that this shift still represents a change in the government's priorities towards more welfare-oriented policies. Put simply, before Moon, South Korea spent a lot less on welfare compared to other rich countries, and under Moon, it started spending more, trying to catch up and better protect its citizens. Another significant challenge for Moon Jae-in was youth unemployment. This was a big promise he made when he took office. High youth unemployment can be a tough issue because it's not just about job availability. It's also about matching young people's skills to the right kinds of jobs and ensuring that the economy is flexible enough to create new opportunities. According to World Bank data, just before Moon took office, South Korea's youth unemployment rate hovered above 10%, which many saw as quite high for an advanced economy, especially when compared to Japan, where youth unemployment was much lower. Moon Jae-in's administration tried various labor market reforms to tackle this issue, but as some local and international analysts pointed out, the results were not immediately impressive. For the first few years of his term, the youth unemployment rate didn't really drop much. It remained above 10%. Critics argued that the government's efforts, like subsidizing youth hiring or pushing companies to hire more young people, did not fundamentally solve underlying problems, such as mismatches in education and labor market needs, or the dominance of large conglomerates, chaebols, that can limit the diversification of the economy's employment landscape. However, if we look at the data extended to 2021 and 2022, we do see youth unemployment gradually coming down to around 8.1% in 2021 and even lower in 2022. While part of this improvement might be attributed to the economy's broader recovery from the pandemic, as well as ongoing government efforts, it also came after years of struggle to make any significant dent in youth unemployment. In other words, while Moon's policies might not have fixed the problem right away, the downward trend by the end of his term could be seen as at least a partial success, or simply the natural outcome of changes in the global and domestic economy after the worst shocks had passed. National debt is another topic of interest. South Korea's gross government debt as a percentage of GDP had been rising even before Moon Jae-in took office. Government debt, in simple words, is how much money a government owes. Too much debt can be risky, but some amount of debt is normal, even in healthy economies. Under Moon, from 2017 to 2019, the debt-to-GDP ratio grew only slightly, from about 38% to about 39.7%. Considering that the US-China trade war was unfolding at that time, which pressured many countries to increase spending or adjust their policies, this small increase is not very large. Compared to the previous administration, 2013 to 2016, the growth in debt to GDP was not necessarily worse. Back then, the ratio rose from about 36% to 39.1% before Moon took office. The big jump in debt came during 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Practically every government worldwide increased spending to keep their economies afloat. Moon Jae-in's administration introduced several stimulus packages, like one in September 2020, which was about 7.8 trillion won, around $6.5 billion at the time, to help people and businesses affected by the pandemic. This spending inevitably added to South Korea's debt, but according to mainstream economic thinking, such stimulus was seen as necessary and even beneficial during a crisis to prevent a deeper downturn. Once the economy started to recover, policymakers could think about reducing debt levels over time. None of this is to say that Moon Jae-in's economic record is flawless. While he did aim to expand social safety nets and manage external shocks, such as rapidly reducing youth unemployment, were not fulfilled as quickly as expected. Critics also pointed out that some of his labor policies and chaebol reforms did not go far enough to break up the power of these large conglomerates. According to several reports and academic analyses, limiting chaebol power is a long-term challenge that requires continuous and structural changes to the legal and business environment. Passing a bill to limit chaebol influence in 2020 was one step. But many believe deeper reforms are needed to address income inequality and employment issues more effectively. Ultimately, Moon Jae-in's economic legacy is still debated. Some will highlight the focus on social welfare and resilience during global shocks as positives, while others will point to missed opportunities, slower growth, and remaining structural problems. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.